but the remaining half of it's going to be gone with the coming of the extension of the new highway. But anyhow, there is Jacksonville. Sam was a teacher in Union County. He taught Georgia history the same as I taught in Towns County. So the students in Union and Towns County should be well versed in Georgia history. Sam had a leadership role in Union County Historical Society, especially with the music on the courthouse. And back early in the spring, I attended a storytelling convention at Blairsville, and I heard Sam tell stories. And afterward, I approached him and I said, Sam, you've got to come to our Historical Society and share some of those stories. So tonight, we are honored to have Sam Ensley talking about growing up in Jacksonville. Thank you, Sam.
Just hold that. All right, good evening. Jerry has worked harder on this presentation than I have because I got my computer all messed up trying to get pictures together, and he spent a big portion of the time today and a whole lot of time yesterday sorting out pictures, trying to get them together. And this might jump around a little bit because it'll kind of go with the flow of the pictures. From now on, every picture made of me will be with that hat on, and I was not really wearing that on Abe Lincoln Day. That's about the time it started out for me, and I was born on Plottown Road. And first, hold it right there a minute, Jerry. I want some people say, well, where is Jacksonville? And I would say that Jacksonville is not an incorporated town, village, or anything. It's always been a village. I remember Miss Hood always talked about what was going on in the village. It was a pleasant little village, but I'll define the parameters. Most of you know where Old Union Church is. It starts at Old Union Church, and then you go down the hill toward Blairsville from Old Union Church, and you come up the hill and round the curve, and right there is downtown Jacksonville. Then going on over and crosses over the Union County line down at the creek, and turn left on Track Rock Road and go. Anybody know with me so far know where I'm talking about? And then go up Track Rock Road to where Plottown Road comes in from the left, and then you would go back to the left, and it's 2 or 3 roads, but all of that, even though they're probably a good ways away, are still considered a part of the Jacksonville area. And then you come down, there's actually a couple of Plottown roads, but then you come down Plottown Road and it comes back into the highway right before you going down the hill out of Jacksonville back toward Old Union Church. Have I confused everybody enough so far? But as Jerry said, we once had a nice little village there, but time and trucks running through buildings and stores pretty well decimated the place. And of course, the old people, when you're young, thought would always be there, gone. But anyway, that was, I was born, you see right across the road, the barn, and if you look to the right of that barn up there, about 300 feet is the house in which I was born. It belonged to Miss Minty Plott. Now, Darius had part of her family. I can't remember what her name was after Nichols, I believe, wasn't it? Anyhow, I was born in that house, and then I'm sitting in my new car there in the driveway of the house that we moved into when I was about 18 months old. It was just a little small shotgun house. But anyway, at that time, my dad was working they were building the dam at Fontana, and he would come home on the weekends, and I would run. At that time, I had no competition. I had no younger brothers and sisters. And I remember running out to to meet him, and I was hugging him, and he said, look in the back seat, and there was that brand new shiny fire truck, and I'd give $5,000 if I had it back now, but I actually ran the wheels off of it and traded what was left to Billy Sosby for some wooden wheels to make a wood wagon. Anyway, but that's kind of what I'm talking about. It's kind of like growing up in Jacksonville. We didn't have much money, or there wasn't any place to get a lot of things. Now, let me give a description of downtown Jacksonville as you came up. You came down the hill from Old Union Church, and then you come up the hill, and like I said, Plot Town Road starts off there, and you see it going up through there. Maybe, yeah, you can see it. But toward the top of the hill, there was a house where the Kimses lived when I was growing up, and then next was my grandmother's house, which was the old Daniel house, and at one time the Daniels had a large family right there in Jacksonville. On the left-hand side was the house where Desi and Archie Jenkins left. A debatable road that went from the highway over to a shortcut over to Plot Town Road. And then on the other side of that lived Mr. and Mrs. Hood. And they were the parents of, I just mentioned Desi Jenkins. And then right past their house was the MC Hood General Merchandise, and it was a true general store. They sold everything from clothing to food to plows, just everything. And across the road from that, like I said, my grandmother's house, growing up right behind that was a house. How many of you know where Dorothy Sampson lives now? Well, that was like in the backyard of my grandmother's house, and the house was originally built by Joe Jackson. I know a lot of you up here in Hiawassee that Joe worked for years at the Hiawassee Hardware Company. And I reckon they sold that house and moved to Ohio for a bit, and then they came back, and then when they came back they lived in Hiawassee. That's how that house got started, and then Joanne Jones bought it for a while and sold it to Ray Sampson, and Ray had retired from Cincinnati and he decided to go where it was warmer, so he moved on down to Miami and sold it to Euless and Dorothy. That's the history of that house. Next house was Frank Abernathy's house, and I first remember it as a white frame house, and right past it was Mr. and Mrs. Cook's house. And I was looking the other day at the 1940 census, and it had to have been before Frank built his house, because living in the big old house, if you know where Marcia and Twiggs, you notice her house sits a good ways back from the road, and that's because when they built that house, they built it behind Granddaddy's old house and then tore it down. They were living in it while they built that, so it sits back. But living in that big old white house was Mr. and Mrs. Cook, their daughter Gladys, and son-in-law Clyde Twiggs. And in 1940, John Twiggs was born, but Ann was still flying around with a net somewhere. And believe it or not, Frank Abernathy and Eula George lived in the same house. And then Miss Sally Daniel lived there. She was a sister to Mrs. Cook, and my grandmother had bought her house, or the old Daniel house, when she moved over that way from Choice Toy. Then across the road, like I said, past the Hood store, there's a lane going out where Clarence and Barbara Collins live now, but Mrs. Pless and Mrs. Bryant lived out there when I was young. They were, and Mr. Bryant still lived there when I was very young. And I think like where we built that house on Plot Town and all that land over there, at one time that had a really good sized farm, but slowly she sold it off. Then right next, across the driveway, that driveway from the Hood store, was Dr. and Mrs. Welburn. And Mrs. Welburn had the original Well, Mrs. Wilburn was originally Sylvia, I'll tell it that way, and her daughter was Caldwell. Tell me, Jennings Caldwell. Well, Margaret, they had a child, Margaret, and her mother died, I think, when she was born. Anyway, Mrs. Wilburn, Margaret always called her mom and called Doc Wilburn. He had an office as the house. You can't see it in any of these pictures, but it had like a bay window, and he had a dentist office in his house. And right past that was a big old two-story house that I think it had been a hotel at one time. I think she's talking about Ivy Lee. Thomas Sims said that her daddy had a used furniture store there at one time. And it had originally been a part of the Welborn house, and they moved it with mules and slid it. The two-story part, of course, it's not 10, 15 feet away from the original house. They'd built a lean-to on the side, and we would get old mattress boxes from Frank Abernathy's furniture store and get on the outside window and slide off the roof on those, we thought. And then right past that was a store that it was a kind of a convenience store, really, and a gas station and that. But anyway, let's get back to the pictures. I'm about to forget where I'm going. That car over in the shed there, I've always been a thing with cars. That was a beautiful gray 36 Ford, and I can't remember whose it was, but it sat there during the whole World War II. Give us this change, Jerry. All right, that was talking about, that's my dad there, and a lot of different people in the community there took turns losing money on that little store, and that was while we were. And this picture I thought was really important because it shows, this was about 1952, and he's standing in front of the kerosene pump, and we did about as much business at the kerosene pump as we did at the gas pump, because there were still a lot of people around who did not have electricity, or if they had electricity, they still needed kerosene to start fires with. So that was, and you can see all the old advertising there. And that was a fun place to be. There was always a bunch of old fellas sitting around the stove. It was a typical old pot-bellied stove and nail kegs. And this stove in the vicinity said years ago that some people not from around here stopped at this place and asked the proprietor if they could use her restroom. And she said, "Oh, we ain't got no restroom, but pull up a nail keg and rest as long as you want to." So, anyway, then the road went to the left, and down that road, and the Robinsons, it was Mr. Ed Robinson and his wife, Jenny, and she was, keep in mind, she was a Caldwell, Caldwell, and then right past that was their son Albert and his wife Ola Kay, and then their daughter Bernice lived at the next house. Talking about growing up, John, she married John Irwin, and they had one daughter Beverly and one son after they moved. And right on the next house was on the right, and a Mr. William Bill Gregory. Some of you from Hiawassee might be more familiar with him, but he was one of we had several people around there who were pushed out of when the lake was built, they had to move and learn how to swim. So Mr. Gregory lived there, and he'd had a son, I remember J.G. Gregory, who was killed in World War II, and Mr. Bill drove his 40 Chevrolet coupe all the time, and he had a big wide front yard, and the big side section of it he had just full of quarter jigs and things. When he had like something that turned, a mule would kick a man back in the barn. I mean, he had everything you can imagine. It was like going, well, it was fun just to go down there and see all those windmills turn. But anyway, the road went on down the hill, and you turn left at the bottom of the hill to Mr. Paul Thomas's. Roy Hughes lived right at the very bottom of the hill, and the road circled on around. There's only one house, George Sampson, till it came back around, came out at the Townsend Mill Road, right at Townsend Mill, right between the mill and where the road goes on back around. We call it 2 West Union. It went over and it's still, I noticed the signs now, it all is called the Townsend Mill Road from where it turns off the main highway and goes all the way around to Byers Creek Road. Anyway, then down from Jacksonville, out the road to the left there, on the corner, the big house that later you'll see pictures that was where Frank Abernathy moved his funeral home. I don't know who lived there before, but most of the time that I remember was Charlie Fields lived there, and then Frank Abernathy bought the place from him, turned into funeral home. On out the road was Von Hughes, and to the left right out there was Jack, another Mr. Robinson's sons, Jack and Irene Robinson. If you stood at the main road back there and looked up that road, you'd see the house where Mrs. Jackson, the widow of Bill Jackson, lived. Now, that picture there, you can see that old 2-story house that I was talking about had been pulled away from the Welborn house. And in that picture, that's my grandmother, Laura Duckworth, and next to her is me, and the bottom on the left is my sister Sarah, my nephew Martin, and my brother Frank Jr. And I can remember whose white car that is. It was Tommy Daniels. Okay. Now this picture across the road is the Welborn house, and you can kind of see where there's a gable at the top coming this way, and you can't see it, but there's a bay window there, and that's where Doc Welborn had his dentist office. You go on the porch, you go into the main door, or you could turn right and go into his dental office. Those children on the back, standing up on this side, is Dale Thurman. Now, they lived at that time, they lived in that big 2-story, you saw just a minute ago. Next to him is David Fulford, and his father was a Methodist minister who was going to Young Harris College, and they rented the house right behind my grandmother's where Dorothy Sampson lives now. Next to me with his arm around my neck is John Twiggs, and next to him is Jimmy Howell. Over in the front row, the boy on the left was Richard Fulford, a brother to David, and Ann Twiggs, she's recognizable next to him in front. And next to her is Beverly Irwin, who I mentioned going down the road, was the daughter of John and Bernice Irwin. And the little girl on the far right, she was a cousin of Johnny and Ann's, and I can't remember her name. But anyway, that was a typical crowd getting together, and somebody took a picture. And that's my younger brother and me. And again, I'm not trying to show these pictures, family pictures, so much as I'm trying to show you the architecture in some of the houses. That old 2-story house again, and you can tell I was a redneck at that time. Look, I got steering wheel knobs on both handlebars and got lights all over my bicycle. I was cool. And you can just switch on through this. These are some pictures that got mixed in. That was my not younger, but my oldest sister, and 3 of the children older than me and my daddy. And this is my mother and dad, and same kids. None of that has nothing to do with it. There we go. That was about 1940, re-roofing Old Union Church. And I believe that little 35 Ford coupe sitting in the front was my brother's. He had one, as I can remember, looked just like that. And there's some more pictures of that car with the Plot sisters in the Towns County book. Somebody might have seen that. Now you notice that I believe that probably was, somebody told me they didn't get a steeple until about that time. And you notice that the church faces faces what I still call the new church across the road. It was across the road from the church now. Now, that's the way I remember it right there, but Margaret Wilburn, or Caldwell Jones, told me that the church originally had the doors at the back of the church, and like most old churches, had two doors, one for the women to go in and one for the men to go in, and it faced back in the cemetery. Well, they were having a revival, and down in Brasstown somewhere, there was a bunch that come up and set up a camp, and they're drinking and carrying on down in the cemetery, and it was disrupting the church services. And she said one night that these men, don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating the Ku Klux Klan, but I'm just telling you what happened then, and I don't think this was a Ku Klux Klan, but these men in robes, white robes and hoods, and they all came up and came up through the cemetery and marched into the church, marched around up to the front, and each one of them laid something down on the pulpit and said a word or two to the preacher and turned around and walked out. And then as it went down through the cemetery, they had a little word with the people down the cemetery, and they all left and never had any more trouble. Now, Margaret said she was just a little girl and was down looking, and she was looking at the feet, and she said, "There's Daddy's shoes." Somebody had his shoes on. Okay, go ahead. That, you talk about, and growing up, I don't know two of those, but if you turn up Plot Town Road from, like I said, coming from the church up toward Jacksonville and turn left on Plot Town, the first house was Miss Bird's, and she was daughter of Mrs. Green, and that's Mrs. Green, the older lady sitting in the car. And the Greens lived in, and if you've never seen it, there's a big old white house there that has porch downstairs and upstairs, and the stairs are not, don't go up from the inside, they go up from the outside. Well, by this time, Mr. Green had died, and Miss Iva Green, the daughter, was just turned her mother, and her mother was crippled with arthritis, and so when it come to church, if it's like bad weather or anything, the men at the church, she had one of those little squeaky wheelchairs, bamboo-like stuff and everything, and every time she took a stroke and everything, and it would just squeak. But if the weather was nice, she'd just hold, Miss Green would teach her Sunday school class outside. She'd just sit in the car like that and teach her class. But these older girls are too old to have been in her class. She taught the little chicks, she called them. And that's her sitting there. The far left is my sister Willabelle, they called her Fritz. Next to her is our cousin Marie, Ensley, daughter of Floyd and Alma. They called her, I thought her name was City because her brothers couldn't say sister, so they called her City, and that was the name that stuck with her. And then that's my other sister, and my brother Bob standing next to her. Now I'll try to tell you a quick story about, that's my trouble is I get on these side roads. But anyway, Miss Green would sit out there, and one day, and this is when I was a little one, and we were all gathered around out there, and we heard a noise coming from off the mountain up there, and we looked, just saw like a flash of red flying through the trees that come around. And Taylor Ledford lived like up into that road, and he had an old 26 Nash. He painted, if somebody remember, he painted about every year with a brush, usually the body some kind of red and fenders black. And he was coming down there, and obviously he was out of control, and so us biddies, we were running behind cars, and poor old Miss Green spinning recaps off that wheelchair trying to get out of the way. And it made me think of a thing that happened not long ago. He came down there, and there was it's like the light pole stood there, a light pole and a guy wire, and he hit that guy wire, and that little thing spun around a time or two and knocked a tombstone over, and that was about it. Now, at that time, my dad had that shop going toward Young Harris at the bottom of the hill, and I asked him about it later, because he said that what Taylor had done was he had old mechanical brakes and had a rod that was supposed to go through the through the thing, and but anyway, the rod had got lost, so he had stuck a nail through there and secured it with rusty hay baling wire. So when he first slammed on the brakes, there went all of his work that he had done, because it had no brakes at all. And then he tried to put it in lower gear, and all I did was it knocked it out of gear. So he was coming in there as J.D. Stevens, you might have heard, told Harold Rayburn he had a wreck up on Track Rock, and he said, boys, nobody got hurt. And he said, well, all I can say is you had the Lord was riding with you. And J.D. said, well, if he was, he had a hell of a ride. So I need to get faster. And that's the ladies group there, and that on the far right, that's the Miss Iva Green I was talking about, the old. And the only two that the girl with the dress in the front with kind of plaid, that's one of Tom and Bonnie Jenkins' daughters, and they lived just right there. They didn't continue on the main road, but they lived on the left, right there. And Tom's wife was another one of the Caldwell girls. And the girl right to the left of her was Emma Louise Jenkins, and I believe over there wearing a hat, the one to the left was Clarabelle, and I don't know any of the rest of them. All right. Now, Frank moved his funeral home. If you look at that furniture store from front, you'll see it's actually consists of two buildings, and there's about 3 or 4 feet between them, and then they're joined together. And the funeral home was on the left, and then the Fields moved up into North Carolina, and Frank turned the Fields house into a funeral home. And you see there he had that old black hearse to the left. That's an old 49 Cadillac. Before that time, he had an old LaSalle. Johnny and I he had parked it up there behind his house, and Johnny and I were going to camp out one night, and we got up there and we got in our sleeping bags, and for some reason the conversation got around to that old LaSalle hearse, and wondering how many people it hauled, and all of a sudden we decided to just wait till another time to go camping. But anyway, that's the Fields house. Is kind of, well, it's still there. It's a church now. All right, that was young Harris, I guess, got a new fire truck, and of course Frank was very civic minded, and he was always like to be at the forefront of everything. And that fellow on the very front here was Tom Flanagan. He worked for Frank at that time, and that's the two little kids there. The one right behind Tom is Tommy Flanagan. A lot of you, I'm sure about everybody here knows him. And to the left of him is Jackie Jones. And I can't tell, Mike Myers is standing on the ground. But anyway, it was a celebration that, well, I don't remember seeing that truck in Young Harris, but we certainly didn't have one in Jacksonville. Now look at that building on the left of Frank's store. And you see there's like a screen door. That was Mr. Cook's barbershop, Mr. Calvin Cook. Now, the college, back when Coke first came out, they outlawed all soft drinks in Young Harris. They were dopes, and that's why you still find people still call them any soft drink was a dope, except Orange Crush was a yeller dope. Well, Mr. Cook sold Cokes there in that store because Jacksonville didn't have any. Like I said, it wasn't a town; it was just a place. And so they said that he made a whole lot more money selling Cokes than he did cutting hair during it. About 1917, 18, and drive on. That's where Frank had somebody had found a deer, and back up behind his house and back up behind my grandma's house, he had a pen there, and that Jerry told me that the fella there that's helping Ann, that's Byron Herbert Reese. And that's Frank with the hat on, and I don't recognize the other fella. Now this is what Jacksonville looked like when Frank had his big Christmas giveaway. Does anybody remember those things? I mean, for $1, whether you spent $1 on a funeral or whether you bought a spittoon, you got a ticket for every dollar's worth of business you did. And then right before Christmas, he would have a big drawing, and I mean, he gave away bedroom suits, living room suits, washing machines, anything, on down to sets of silver and fans and stuff. And I mean, the place was crowded. You can see right there. And ahead of the building on the right, ahead, that's the Hood's General Store, and you see the cook's house on the left. Right. That's some of those people that work for Frank. I don't know, I see Glenn Roberts, and I believe that's one of those older fellas sitting down in the middle on the left. I believe the fellow in the middle was Burns. He lived right on there after the Track Rock, after you turned up Track Rock and then turned left on Plottown Road again. All that land, it was called Plottown because you got to realize that the Plots and the Brysons were the first to settle in Young Harris and everything. So the one arm of the Plots went up and to me got the best part of the deal. They got all up in Plottown, all up, and that's my brother's wrecked car there on the left, but across the road is the building that started Jacksonville. That was the store that Bill Jackson opened his first store in, and you can see just a track and another building on that there, and you can see the road going out there and a car parked out there in the driveway. I don't know if at one time that was the Jackson's house or not, but I know that I've seen pictures. The McConnells moved, were some people that moved from over here when the lake was built, and they lived in that house. And actually, Joe Jackson married, can't remember the name, I met her. They all went to, my family and a lot of the McConnells and people go north to get jobs after the war, and a lot of them up to Moline, Illinois, and worked in John Deere factory. And anyway, the McConnell girl married George Palatka, like Palatka, Florida. But anyway, moving on, there you see the beginnings of Jacksonville, and that's my brother's car that was wrecked in the middle, and I'm sure they started taking those pictures for insurance. Over the high bridge, going out 75, I don't know if you know, he and Sonny Bull McClure, I don't know what they were doing, but they forgot to stop or anything, and just kept going at the end. Oh, how many people, now don't mention it, just how many people raise your hand if you recognize that lady? All right, she was Margaret Bird, Margaret Dendy. Now I'd had these old negatives for years, and I had just assumed that was my oldest sister because they were friends and went to school together, and I just thought that was her. But when I finally had them developed, and said, no, that's not Fritz, that's Margaret. And that's my dad's Studebaker, and that's the car that set me on the road to liking Studebakers to this day. My wife wished I had never had that car, I guess, but we had a backyard full of Studebakers, so most of them she called yard art. Now there you got, folks, that's on Plottown Road, right their house, and there I was getting my first good car. I'd had some old Model A's that we had cut the bodies off of and run around up and down when they were building Track Rock. But now that's your dude of the summer of 1956. About the only thing I didn't have any cigarettes rolled up in that t-shirt. And you'll notice my redneckness stuck with me. See my fender skirts and the treatment on my lights. All right. Now there you have two budding people. That was 8th grade, and that's me and Charles Hughes. I bought that mandolin, and I don't have time to tell you the story behind that, from back in those days, I was in 8th grade coming to Hiawassee to school by that time, but we didn't have telephones, so Vernon Roberts said his brother had 2 mandolins he'd sell, and I said, he told me, described them, one was $4 and one was $5, and one of them had a little curlicue. I said, bring it. He said, no, his brother said that mandolin wouldn't leave the house till he had the money in his pocket, so I sent him $5 and I'd splurge and take the best one. And Charles is playing, many boys learned to play, that was one of them $9.99 Sears Roebuck cowboy models. And we couldn't play, we never did. It was a long time, I learned to play a little bit in the 8th grade. Believe it or not, I still have that mandolin. That's another story another time. But Charles had a cousin, Flora May. She likes to be called Flossie, I believe now. And now this is way back before, I mean, people around Jacksonville couldn't even afford a typewriter, so there was no, anything you did, you had to write it down, and there was no television back in those early days. And Flora May would listen to the radio and painstakingly write down all of these country songs, and once in a while she'd let Charles and me borrow that notebook, and we'd gather around and we'd sing those songs, and like I said, we'd pretend we were strumming those instruments. We didn't know anything about it. But that's how you enjoyed yourself growing up in Jacksonville. And that was one that just got stuck on there. That I was working on, John, by the way, will be at the old courthouse in Blairsville this Friday night. You've heard of the Nick's brothers, John and Clayton, and they always played at the Sorghum Festival, and that was the band. I did, how many of you would remember Opera in the Wildwood that John Cable had out? They didn't particularly want me to, but I played drums. That's the first time I ever appeared on stage, playing drums with them out there. Now, this is another important thing that you need to notice here. This is out Track Rock Road. Ed Collins, a lot of you, that old house been torn down. And this picture, I had a better one that showed the back end of that truck more, and that's what I was interested in. Can any of you see on the back side of that truck, that round? Well, back in those days, a lot of people, if they had a vehicle at all, it was a big truck like that, because they used it in making a living and logging or farming or whatever. And so it was also like the family car too, and to help you get up into the back a little easier, you'd cut the side out of an old truck tire and nail it up there, and that would give you a step to get up. Now, it's important to, not many people had cars back in those days. I could lie in bed at night, and if a car went by, I know who it was. That's true. And Mr. Ed that's kind of, you're looking there at the church bus, old Union church bus. Not many people had cars, and he'd start out from there, and by the time he'd get to Old Union, the bed would be full of people. And they'd know, they'd come walking out the side roads and whatever, and where the Townsend Mill Road comes out there, though, there'd be a pretty good crowd right there waiting, and then ride to church. And then they would usually take that truck and go somewhere Sunday afternoon, and Ned would make an announcement in church that they were going so and so, that if anybody wanted to go, to meet there at the church at 2 o'clock, I guess. And I remember riding over, a whole bunch of people riding on the back of that truck over the fields of the woods, over in North Carolina. And another time, and it's probably has been one of the most throughout my life, was 1948. We went up to Hiawassee, and I mean, it's loaded. My grandma got to ride in the front of the truck, and back of it was full. We got up here to Hiawassee to the old courthouse to see Carl Story and the Rambling Mountaineers. Does anybody remember that bunch? From WNOX, Midday Merry-Go-Round, and this one thing that always cracked Jerry up. In the daytime, you had the midday merry-go-round that, I wondered if I always had at lunch. And finally, my grandma said, well, everybody farms, and they come in to eat lunch, and they listen to the country music. And And WNOX was probably the most, it was kind of a feeder, if you want to call it such, a feeder station for the Grand Ole Opry. A lot of people went to the Grand Ole Opry for midday merry-go-round, and Carl Story was one of the main people. And I remembered that later on I met him and spent a lot of time with him, and I wish I could spend more time. One of the most fascinating people I've ever seen. He could remember everything. He remembered coming to Hiawassee. I said, I know you don't remember this, but I said, when I was 8 years old, you came with Carl Story to Hiawassee and performed one Sunday afternoon at the old courthouse. And he said, yeah, I remember that. And I thought to myself, oh, don't be that way. He said, yeah, I remember riding over in Claude Boone's new Packard. And I remember Carl Story mentioning it. Claude Boone, one of the members of the band, and actually he was one of the musicians in Bill Monroe's first recording. But anyway, he said, are you from Hiawassee? And I said, no, I'm actually from Young Harris, or part of it called Jacksonville. And he started laughing. He said, I remember we played over at the Young Harris Grammar School, and this gal sent us a grocery list. Now, at the same time every day that you had the midday merry-go-round, you had Kaz Walker's radio station, and Kaz Walker was an old dude. He's always talking about his foxhounds. and he had these supermarkets, and he just advertised his supermarkets all the time. And actually, when Red died, he was still moved up to TV and was still working for, I guess, Kaz Walker at that time, but working for Kaz Walker on TV. But anyway, Red said, Young Harris said, this woman sent us a grocery list. And I said, you're not going to believe this, but my mama wrote that letter. And he said, what? I said, well, there's a family close to us, couldn't read and write, but they loved midday merry-go-round. They loved Carl's Story. And so they'd come down, get Mama to write a letter, and this gal kind of knew how to dictate a letter. She just couldn't write. And I remember it went something like this: Dear Carl, so glad you're coming to the, we listen to you every day. Want you to sing a song on the air, and name the whole family, and I named the song, and said, so glad you're coming to the Young Harris Grammar School. That's what everybody called it back then, to the Young Harris Grammar School. So can't wait for you to see our baby, and said, but said, since you're coming from Knoxville anyway, could you bring us 25 pounds of flour, 4 pounds of lard? You know, that was your usual old, people would get there about a month, they'd get 25 pounds. So anyway, but we'd better get off that. Somebody's going to recognize who I'm talking about. I believe that might be Blake Bryson, and that the picture I believe is over at the college farm. But other than that, I don't know how that picture got in, Jerry. So. And that's another. They left that in there because the fellow in the middle is Floyd Ensley, and way back he's my cousin. The fellow on the left was a Hollander, and he lived over there, just going out Track Rock Road, just right past where the Plottown Road comes in there. You can still see, they used to have a big old 2-story house right down next to the road, you can still see. And next to him is Garfield Ensley, that was my daddy's brother, and next to him is Floyd Ensley, and then that's my dad, and then on the far right is my Uncle Hayes Souther. He married my daddy's sister, Etta. And Floyd lived in Young Harris, and actually he built Sharp Memorial Church, and he built the administration building at the college. That's it. Well, that came out just about like certain biscuits. Mark said that's the hardest thing to do, to make certain biscuits come out even. Anybody else? If I can take your time one more minute. When we started to school, and I didn't realize that our building at Young Harris, the elementary school, and I didn't realize at the time, but it's a fairly new school because the PTA club, Mrs. Carter Berry, And by the way, Carter Berry, did anybody know Carter Berry's nephew, George Berry? Did you know he just died? It hadn't been a month ago that he came over to the Union County Historical Society, and talked about his climb. And I tell you what, he had nothing handed to him. Anyhow,
Sammy, you didn't tell us about your career of being a cheerleader at the Towns County High School.
I didn't.
Being a cheerleader at Towns County High School.
Oh yes, it was, back in those days, Towns County only had a basketball team, didn't have enough students to field a football team, and not money to buy equipment if you did. And I was never very athletic. I was always sickly and puny. But it got about the 10th grade, and Jack Edwards lived over at Young Harris, and man, what we want to do is go on those ball trips, Cleveland and all those places. And so we said, well, we wasn't good enough to make the ball team, and tried out to be managers, so we could go out, and no, we didn't have any pool to do that. So Jack said, well, I guess we'll have to go out for cheerleading. And I said, why not? He said, oh, we can't do that. But see, at Young Harris, they had male cheerleaders at their basketball team, so it was not a totally strange thing to us. So it was, well, why not? So we went out for cheerleading. I see Joetta laughing back there, because how many of you remember the time we tried out for cheerleading? Well, Virginia Palmer, she was a fellow cheerleader too. She was with us. I think that's where I started having back problems. Look, some of those around. And you see, we'd build a pyramid, and Jack and I'd be on the bottom, and all these girls standing up. But anyway, we made a cheerleading team, and I know that Janice Stevens that time, Wofford is her name now, but she told us, she said, you might think you were smart getting elected because you tried out in front of the whole school. Well, you got two guys up there doing a thing. I mean, if nothing else, people probably thought it was a joke, and in reality, I guess it was. But yeah, we won by a big majority, just because it was different. But Jenny said, you've been this far, but she said, I've got the power to kick you off this team if you don't work. So we worked, and we enjoyed it. And I believe the next year there were 6 male cheerleaders, and there were male cheerleaders for a long time. But let me run back here to Young Harris. And it wasn't any of this stuff, no kindergarten or anything, first grade, of course school started like usually I think about Labor Day then, and I was 5, I wasn't 6 until November. So here comes this old bus down the road, said, there's a school bus, you got your book satchel and your lunch bucket, get on it and go to school. And I did, and we were in Miss Potts' room, and of course the school, it was a new building. It might have been about 2nd or 3rd year, but of course it had no plumbing of any kind, and so water was procured by some of the older boys going to neighbors and drawing water out of a well, and they'd have change frequently. The people would get mad at boys splashing water, but then we'd carry an old fire bucket back to school. And Miss Potts told us, she said, now listen, don't drink out of the dipper, because most people at home, they had a water bucket in the kitchen, they won't drink water, they just pick up the dipper and get them a drink of water. I learned one word that I've remembered ever since, the first day of school, and that was unsanitary. I bet she used it 25 times. It's unsanitary, it'll make you sick. I thought, well, never have got sick yet. Anyway, and then she showed us how to make those little dunce caps, that you fold the paper up and hold water. And she said, now tomorrow, if everybody will bring me a glass, I mean, this is way before plastic cups. She said, everybody bring a glass to school tomorrow, and I'll put your name on it. And Boy, the snuff glasses rolled in. Well, I mean, everybody, you use snuff glasses, drink out of it, put your jelly up in, whatever else. We couldn't have survived without snuff glasses. And she put her name on them with fingernail polish, because this was before magic markers and stuff. But we survived, and we learned what was unsanitary. And I'm sure that about all of you had about as good a place to grow up as I did, but no, I tell you what, I wouldn't trade growing up in Jacksonville for anything. And thank you for your patience and listening to me.